This is what you see when you first walk into Jungle View. On the right, the hotel with its veranda, where I spent more than 7 weeks making this film. And on the left, a wall of rainforest directly in front of you, forming part of Periyar National Park. Most of the filming was done sitting from that plastic chair just there on the right. My first task every morning was to set up my Panasonic Lumix camera on its tripod. As you can see, I don't have to move far from my room, it's directly behind me. Even some of the wildlife comes in pretty close, such as this spectacular Malabar giant squirrel. A pair had a territory which encompassed the hotel grounds, so they were present at close quarters almost every day. From now on, everything is in chronological sequence. Most squirrels have a diet of nuts and bark. This one eats a lot of leaves, which it carefully folds in its front paws before eating. Note how it tests each leaf for edibility by sniffing it. This is one of the world's largest squirrels. Body and tail together can reach a length of some 3 feet, about 1 metre. Yet now we can go from one of the largest to one of the smallest on the tree trunk close by. Various species of these tiny palm squirrels are found throughout India and Sri Lanka. They're often common right in the centre of large busy cities. A third species of mammal common around the hotel is the bonnet macaque monkey. The bright pinkish red face is typical of adult females. It's the tufted hairdo that gives rise to the common name, as if it's wearing a hat. I filmed the giant squirrels almost every day, but this was the first time I saw both together. They always descend a tree trunk head first. They were really noisy squirrels and were constantly calling. But I only managed to film them uttering their squeaky chatter once. Right in front of my room, a philodendron plant twined its way up one of the tree trunks. Every 7 or 8 days, one or both of the giant squirrels would pay a visit to sample its leaves and stems. While they were actually feeding, their relationship seemed pretty good. But once they finished, it seemed to break down rather. In the forest next to the hotel was the biggest wasp nest I've ever seen. It must have been almost 1 metre long from top to bottom. In the cool of the early morning, thousands of tiny workers came out and milled around on the surface of the nest. It was to be almost 2 weeks before I got my first acceptable coverage of the Nilgiri Langa monkey. Its diet consists almost completely of the leaves of trees, hence its alternative name, leaf monkey. Not common, it's found only in southern India, in large tracts of forest. In my third week, the squirrels suddenly started engaging in mad chases through the high canopy of the forest. This presumably had some kind of sexual function. After a week or so of chasing, this suddenly stopped and they started carrying mouthfuls of leafy twigs. They were obviously starting to build a nest high up in one of the trees. We had a lot of rain. After a night's rain, morning brought a forest heavy with mist.
Come down here, that's too high, that one.
As they busily fed, the langurs were just ghost-like outlines. But by late morning the sun was out and the red Hallam butterflies were active. As with most tropical swallowtails, the wings are constantly fluttered while the butterfly feeds. Apart from the red heron, the only other visitor to these brightly coloured blooms was this small flower pecker. I spent 2 whole days carefully searching the vegetation around the hotel for the local version of the St Andrew's cross spider. I found 24 in all sitting in their webs. Note how the adult spider sits in the middle in a gap in a cross of white zigzag silk called stabilimentum. Notice the tiny jackalfly arriving to take its share of this particular spider's prey. Juvenile spiders, in the stage before their final moult, construct a complete white cross with no gap in the middle. This spider has just undergone its final moult. It's hanging now by a single thread from its old skin. After moulting, an essential task is to flex its legs to keep them supple. This was one of several webs which contained a female and a tiny attendant male. This female killed her suitor shortly after I filmed them. There he is, hanging below her leg, wrapped in silk. Once or twice a week, a male flameback woodpecker would turn up to search the tree trunks in front of my room. The male's mate was seldom far away, but she was more timid than he was, and she was always deeper in the forest and more difficult to film. Right in front of the hotel veranda, one of the jackfruits had finally become ripe enough for the giant squirrels to decide that they could start eating it. bits of jackfruit often got caught on the fur on the squirrel's face. This obviously became quite an irritation, so eventually it had to deal with it. It solved the problem very simply by rubbing its face on the tree trunk. While feeding, often for half an hour or more, the whole weight of the squirrel's body is suspended from the hind feet, the claws dug securely into the bark. Once the squirrels, with their chisel-like front teeth, had started the work of demolishing the jackfruit, then this gave a chance for the macaque monkeys to move in. Their teeth are less suited for opening up the tough outer skin, with its protective covering of surprisingly sharp prickles. If you're wondering what that large bulge is, just below the monkey's face, it's the cheek pouch. These are used for storing food that's not eaten immediately. Surprisingly large amounts of food can be stashed away in these pouches.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. You see what I can see? Look, come here. You see the pouches really well.
If the monkey feels it can stuff yet more food into its bulging pouches, it'll go down for another load. Just look at those pouches now, they've just got to be nearly full. And in fact shortly afterwards the monkey gave up and moved away. The squirrels were still paying regular visits to tuck into the philodendron on the tree trunk. This time I managed to capture a particularly good leaf folding sequence. When I heard this chick sound, I immediately recognised the alarm call of one of the tiny forest squirrels. So I picked up the camera on its tripod and rushed to film it, passing the source of the problem, the hotel's cat, as well as a second squirrel also beginning to sound the alarm. With the danger over, the squirrel could go back to its normal day-to-day business. One of their main food sources was the bark of a particular tree, which they visited regularly. Several times each day, the squirrel scent marks its territory with glands below the mouth. This blue-flowered vine covered some of the trees right beside the hotel. In the early mornings, it was much visited by large bees. But it was also visited by a different animal, the giant squirrel, and for much more destructive purposes. It relished both the leaves and the flowers. One afternoon I was sitting comfortably in my plastic seat when a noisy row broke out in the forest nearby. Some of the macaques were having a fight. Panic spread rapidly. Then, after a couple of minutes, it all calmed down as quickly as it had started. In the warm gold of the evening sunlight, the members of the same troop were quietly feeding, eating berries as if nothing had happened. This group actually spent most of the day in a nearby town, grabbing any opportunity to steal human food from shops or houses. Then every evening they would return to the forest to sleep, directly in front of the hotel. In a garden right next to the hotel, there was a dead palm tree. I kept an eye on it for woodpeckers, but this time it was a white-cheeked barbet that I managed to film. Barbets use their strong beaks to excavate nest holes in dead trees. This one is prospecting for a suitable site for a nest hole. I never saw it again, so presumably it was unsuccessful. This is a widespread and common bird throughout much of India, unlike the Malabar grey hornbill. This is found only in a relatively small area in the south. Unfortunately, most birds just didn't sit around long enough for me to get a long sequence. These hill miners flew off as soon as I focused on them. A stork-billed kingfisher with its huge beak gave me slightly longer. With this rufous tree pie, I had about 10 seconds. Towards the end of my stay, the giant squirrel started sniffing around on a second jackfruit. Testing it for ripeness. The decision came out positive. Here we're looking at the first few bites. Strangely enough, the squirrel seemed to reject most of the fruit and cast it to one side, making them very wasteful feeders. Much of the flesh within the fruit just dripped down the outside in a gooey mess and fell to the ground. After a full half hour of continuous guzzling, the squirrel had finally had enough and moved off. It spent the next 2 hours on a high branch, digesting its meal before coming back for another go. With the chisel-like teeth of the squirrels having officially opened the outer coat, now the macaques could join in the feast. As mentioned before, the flesh of the jackfruit is quite sticky and gooey. The monkeys obviously don't like having it on their fingers and frequently lick it off. After 2 days under constant attack, this was all that was left of the jackfruit. And now that both squirrels have joined in, it soon disappeared completely. Behind me is the forest in which all this was filmed. In front of me is the hotel veranda. This is the trunk of the jackfruit tree that was visited by the monkeys and particularly by the giant squirrels.